Thanks everybody for coming along for a start. But what I really wanted to do was just put into context some of the really interesting stuff that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years that's changed the way that we are thinking about vegetation evolution in Australia in particular. And there's been some really impressive finds that I must say I certainly didn't predict coming. So we'll see how we go doing that. So let me just put this into context to start with, for those of you that are unaware of this. Flowering plants dominate the Australian vegetation. We know now with pretty great certainty that flowering plants evolved somewhere inside that ellipse from Brazil through Africa up into the Mediterranean. And we know that from pollen evidence, and we know that it was sometime around 120 to about 140 million years ago. So from that time onwards, flowering plants took a little while to get going. But they, later in the Cretaceous, started to dominate the vegetation, and they've never looked back from that point. So that's the starting point, is something like 120 million years ago. And then there's a really interesting question about what the first flowering plants looked like. And if you look in any textbook that's more than about 7 or 8 years old, then you get things like this. On the left there is the mature reproductive structure of Archaeanthus, but they've also found flowers and leaves, and they can reconstruct the whole plant, part of which is on the right, and that's got the classic magnolia, liriodendron kind of look, which has traditionally been regarded as the primitive flowering plant. Beetle pollinated, all the things you'd kind of like to think they did. But in the last few years, there's been a real turnaround in that, and it's been led by the 3 people at the bottom there, Elsie Marie Fries, Carl Pedersen and Peter Crane. And what they did was go looking in Cretaceous sands in the Northern Hemisphere, and they found these tiny black particles where no one else had ever bothered to look for fossils. And when they started looking in detail, they found that they had extraordinary structure to them. So the fossil is on the right here, a living relative of it on the left. Over here is a fossil male flower that's so reduced it's just 3 stamens, is the whole flower, and there's an example from the Chloranthaceae living today, and so on. They're all very small, too small to see with the naked eye, apart from being specks. But when you look at them in detail, they're extraordinarily well preserved, quite easy to identify, and in fact the internal structure is beautifully preserved. So they took them to CERN and got these amazing videos done of a 3-dimensional slice down through the middle of them, reconstructing the entire flower in the bud in this case. And again, this is a specimen that's only 1.5 millimetres in diameter, so they're tiny, they're little herbaceous tiny things, very different to the big showy magnolia flowers that have normally been regarded as the first flowering plants. So the thing that's interesting about all of those specimens is they're black because they're charcoal. They've all been burnt, and one of the nice things about charcoal is that it stays very 3-dimensional, and so you get those incredible 3-dimensional structures with great cell detail inside them. And a lot of interest has started to come around fire ecology as a result of this and other things that are going on. I suspect global warming is making people wake up a bit about fire as well, because we're getting such intense and devastating fires happening. More research is being pushed into that area. So fire's been called a global herbivore, and there's really good evidence to show that fire has been an important aspect of the ecosystems for at least 350 million years, and you can take that as saying for at least as long as there's been plants on land that could burn. So there's been fire involved. And as I say there, as soon as plants come out of an aquatic or semi-aquatic environment, fire is part of what happens. And that's through charcoal evidence. So fire is critical, and we understand a lot about fire, but there's some bits about fire that we really don't understand as well as we'd like. It's easy to look at it today and have a fairly good feeling for what's going on. But to state the obvious, if you're going to have fire important in an environment, you need 3 things: an ignition source, and in the absence of us, that's usually lightning, not always, but usually. you need significant amounts of fuel, and the fuel has to be dry enough to burn. And that's the critical issue: how dry is dry enough? And the answer to that question is that depends on how much oxygen there is in the atmosphere. So oxygen today is about 21% of the atmosphere, but it hasn't always been like that. Oxygen is effectively, or is the byproduct of photosynthesis, and far and away the main reason there's oxygen in the atmosphere is that we have photosynthetic plants constantly pumping it out there as a waste product of photosynthesis. So if you look at it in really crude terms, and this is about as good as it gets still, if you go through the whole history of life back to 3 billion years ago, you see this sort of step feature of oxygen in the atmosphere up to the current level at 100%. Well, that's not especially helpful, but that's hit on the broadest possible scale. So what I'm really interested in is what's going on in this last apparently stable piece here. And if you go looking, if you want to get really confused and utterly bewildered by different approaches to the same problem, go and have a look for reconstructions of atmospheric oxygen over the last 400 million years. Every possible answer is out there, all presented with equal authority. So I've picked the one that suits my argument best. And there's good reasons for doing this. So there's some very interesting things you can say about oxygen. Firstly, if you go below about 10 to 15% of oxygen in the atmosphere, you can't sustain a fire. So you couldn't strike a match, it wouldn't burn. So it seems to me reasonable that if you have charcoal in the environment, then the oxygen level was above 10 to 15%. Many of the reconstructions put oxygen below that level when there's charcoal in the environment. They have to be wrong. If you go up to about this grey, purple bit in here, say 15, around 17%, you can light a fire, but it's going to be extremely difficult to sustain it, and you're not going to see much evidence of it in the terrestrial environment. Then you go through a band which is more or less current conditions. We sit on the green line here, and in those you know what fire's like. If the fuel is dry, if you light a match, it'll burn. If the fuel's wet and you light a match, it won't. That's what we understand, that's what we think normal looks like. If you go above that, above about 25% into the 25 to 30% band, you get what's called extreme fire there. If you have an ignition source, the fuel will burn no matter how wet it is, short of being underwater. So in the wettest rainforest, if there's a lightning strike, that wet fuel burns if the oxygen level is at that point. And if you go above something like 30 or maybe 35%, you get spontaneous combustion, and so you can't have terrestrial vegetation. It simply can't exist. So we know, because we've always had terrestrial vegetation since it first appeared, that the oxygen level on Earth has never been in this red band, even though many of the reconstructions push it well into it. So they've got to be wrong. So this one, I think, is a pretty good estimate of what's gone on. The problem with this reconstruction is that they based it on the charcoal estimates, and then they used it to explain the charcoal estimates. But there's more logic to it than that. It's not quite as bad as it sounds, but it is potentially very circular. What this one suggests is that through most of the Cretaceous, which is this bit in here, oxygen levels were much higher than they are today. Fire was very frequent in the environment, and hence you get all these angiosperm fossils that are charcoal. And those plants had to be super adapted to high fire frequencies. And they were early successional plants, almost all of them. Then, of course, later in the piece, towards the present day, you can see the level drop here and come in pretty much similar to what we have today for the last 50 million years or so. So there's enormous evidence from the Northern Hemisphere for this. All of those black dots there are Cretaceous sites where charcoal has been found at very high levels. That's a review, a map out of a review that was published a couple of years ago, And you notice they don't even bother to put the southern hemisphere on the map because there is no data, or there was no data at that stage from the southern hemisphere. Cretaceous sites are very hard to find in the southern hemisphere, that also have flowering plant remains in them. So that's something we'd like to fix. And I think last year we found the first evidence in Australia of a late Cretaceous site that contains abundant flowering plant remains. And this is one of the plates out of that paper. So this is from Central Australia, a place called Huckata. It's a core site, so it's a place where they've gone exploring, drilled a very deep core, and then in part of that core there were plant remains. These are microscopic, but they're macro plant remains. These are all leaf cuticles. The preservation is exceptional. Some of these are fossils. I think most of them are fossils above about there. These are all living plants for comparison. So there's a few things you can say about these. They're all in the family Proteaceae. Not every fossil found there was in Proteaceae, but Proteaceae dominated. They have very small leaves. That's a 200 micron scale bar there. So that's the whole leaf width. The leaf is just about 1 millimetre wide. So they're tiny leaf things. They're scleromorphic, that is, they're adapted to low nutrient levels. Some of them have sunken stomates, which is xeromorphic. They're adapted to low water levels. And there are charcoal particles in the deposit as well. So in this particular site in Central Australia 75 million years ago, we've got evidence of low nutrients, low water availability and high fire frequency. Three things which a few years ago we never would have believed was possible for the late Cretaceous. Included in this, just out of interest, this one, and this is the living equivalent, is almost certainly Banksia. So we've got Banksia in the living genus at 75 million years ago. Again, something that never would have been predicted only a few years ago. And I don't doubt for a minute we'll find more evidence of that as we go. So this is really quite interesting. So let me just explain this. One of the things that I get annoyed about in the papers that are written on living plants in Australia is the confusion between these two terms, scleromorphy and xeromorphy. They're not interchangeable terms. Scleromorphy is a term that has been used to talk about the hardness or harshness of leaves, but it is primarily a low nutrient response, and in particular a response to low soil phosphorus. Xeromorphy, on the other hand, describes morphological characters associated with plants growing under conditions of low water availability. It's a drought response. Sometimes the two get used interchangeably, and that is a real pain if you're interested in how they evolved in the first place. So I just wanted to make that distinction here. And that's typical scleromorphic vegetation in southwestern Australia. So this is something we can tease apart in the fossil record, and I just want to go through this a little bit because one of the other things we found recently is that's really important is best described by first going through this. Some scleromorphic characters are ex-apted or pre-adapted, if you like, for xeromorphy. So little tough leaves that are a response to low nutrients might have been very handy if the climate started drying out. It would have given those plants an evolutionary advantage. But there are some xeromorphic characters that you would never expect to find in a straight scleromorphic plant. And the most notable of those is protection of the stomates. Plants protect their stomates if they're in trouble for water. There's no reason that a plant growing in low nutrient levels but with plenty of water would do anything to try and hide its stomates away from the open air. They're still trying to maximise their growth rates. So in lots of living species in Australia, in the Australian vegetation, and really notably in the Proteaceae, you see some bizarre forms of stomatal protection in dry environments. And here's an example in Banksia. So this is a section through a Banksia leaf. That's the leaf margin. The main vein's over here somewhere. On the lower surface, the stomates are in these small indentations. If you look at a typical Banksia leaf, the veins look like they stand out a bit. The reason for that is they're allowing the stomates to be hidden in a bit of a crypt. which gives a bigger boundary layer, less transpiration rate. Another Banksia species here with much more pronounced pits, even better protection for the stomata. And then at the extreme ends of it, you get something like Banksia chemophyton from Western Australia, which grows in sand dunes where the temperature in summer can get to 50 degrees centigrade. And these have the most bizarre stomatal protection I've ever seen, where in the leaf here, here's a bit of it blown up. There's these stomatal pits that go at least halfway through the leaf. They're quite open inside, but they narrow to a really narrow opening on the leaf surface, which is plugged by hairs growing all around it. And the stomates are right down in here. And that's just extraordinary. And if you look at a leaf surface of that species under the scanning electron microscope, you can see these tufts of hairs which show the opening of these pits that are down underneath where the stomates are hiding. And if you look at it in section, that's my attempt to explain what's going on, it's something like that. And I haven't got time to go into what I think is happening here, but it's a complicated piece of physiology to try and do the thought experiment through. No one yet has figured out how to experiment directly in something that's as small as this. So, 75 million years ago, we've got plants that are looking like they're living in an environment with low nutrients, low water, and some fire. Then we've got a gap of about 25 million years to the next fossil record. And at that time, we still find scleromorphic plants, but this is a time when it was starting to get quite a bit wetter, and it's much more rainforest type vegetation. So there's no sign at all of any xeromorphic adaptations. These plants don't have their stomates out on the surface. So, they have their stomates out on the surface. So here's a fossil. You might not see it there, but a section of that fossil, you can see these really pronounced teeth in the leaf, and they are exactly the same as in these living Banksias here from Western Australia, and in every comparison you can make, and we've got very good organic preservation here, those are Banksias. But Banksias growing in low nutrients but with plenty of water around. And that site, which is about 50 million years old, is the oldest site we've got where the rainforest phase had begun. And for more than 20 million years in Australia, almost every place we look at is dominated by really diverse, complex rainforest vegetation. All around Adelaide, complex tropical-like rainforest, even though we were still connected to Antarctica at the time. And if you have a look at what happened to fire at that time, you can see this is just percentage of charcoal in the sediments, all through the Cretaceous and right back into the Jurassic. You get these really high levels, and then around about the end of the Cretaceous, it suddenly plummets, and it more or less stays down there globally through to the present day. And that's globally, that's not Australia, which has a slightly different history for the last little piece of that story. So around the world we see this drop in fire, and it's consistent wherever you look, and it's certainly consistent in Australia in this period here at least, when rainforest definitely ruled the world. So what was going on in there? Lots of things, and I'll sort of go through it in some kind of order, but probably the thing that's most interesting in here is what was happening to carbon dioxide. So the present day level is the green broken line here, about 400 parts per million now. Historically, if you take away the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the historic level is about 280 parts per million, which is roughly what you've got mostly through here. We're anomalously high at the moment. But we're not even trying compared to what was going on back when these rainforests were in full swing. There were levels of carbon dioxide up over 1,000 parts per million, leading to super greenhouse effects, which is why there was no polar ice cap. It was too hot. It's one of the reasons there was no polar ice cap. It also allowed for enormous evaporation off the oceans, and that led to intense and very high rainfall that just went all year round. And you can't do better than that if you want to grow rainforests anywhere. So this is probably the main reason for the big rainforest phase. I don't know why it did it. I'm sure someone does, but I don't. I just know it did. But other things conspired to play a part in this as well, and for Australia in particular, this is really important. So if you go back, this is 34 million years ago, but it doesn't matter which time you pick, around that period, Antarctica was still connected to South America, and Australia was still connected to Antarctica through Tasmania, even though it was beginning to separate. And because of that, you couldn't have a circumantarctic ocean current. And that means instead of what you've got today with the ocean just circulating around Antarctica, the ocean was circulating down to Antarctica, but then back up to the equator. Sorry, the other way, around that way. And likewise over here and over here. So all around the world you had oceans circulating through large bands of latitude. And what that means is that when they're at the equator and the sun's directly overhead, there's a relatively narrow atmospheric barrier, so most of the radiation gets through to the ocean, heats it up. All that really hot water then circulates down to high latitudes and keeps the temperature differential from the equator to the pole from being very high. So again, it's a reason why you've got no ice on Antarctica. Then when Antarctica separates from Australia first and then South America, it changes the ocean currents completely, and so you get this circumantarctic current. Now you've got a large amount of water that's trapped at very high latitudes. The sun is always low in the sky, so if the sun's out there, you know, the atmosphere is this thick, that sun has got this much atmosphere to get through. Most of the energy is lost before it gets to the water, and so this water doesn't heat up anywhere near the way it does if it's up at the equator. The water gets colder, ice starts to form in Antarctica. Ice is a great reflector, so even less of the radiation gets trapped at high latitudes. The ice sheet gets bigger, and you get a positive feedback, and you end up with kilometres of ice in thickness sitting on Antarctica as we have today. So there's a huge difference in the way the climate was set up between 35 or 40 million years ago and what we have now. So by around 45 million years ago at the latest, we had complex rainforests in Australia. It included some scleromorphic taxa. They're not excluded from rainforest at all. It's a low nutrient thing. Those rainforests would have been more or less recognisable to us if we could go and look at them, except that we'd think they were out of place geographically. So what allowed that to happen? An extinct climate with very wet conditions, very high atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. I mean, we really don't know the impact of effectively tropical rainforest growing at 60 degrees south, but that's what was happening around Adelaide, for instance. And there were possibly high natural disturbances, and particularly volcanoes and landslides as the continents were tearing themselves apart, but not fires. There's no way that fire was going to do terribly well in these conditions. And there's no sign of charcoal in any of these deposits. So that takes care of everything except where did the xeromorphic vegetation go? We've got it 75 million years ago, we've got it today. Did it survive through that time of enormous wetness, or did it disappear and then it's re-evolved into the present vegetation? When you start finding Proteaceae and Banksias 75 million years ago, it's tempting to believe they survived it somehow. So you go looking for it. And finally, we found it, and we know at least to some degree where these plants were hiding. Now keep in mind the fossil record is heavily biased towards wet climates. Fossils like forming in lakes and rivers and the ocean, so you tend to have a high bias towards vegetation that forms under wet conditions, but not entirely. And here's some plants from Western Australia that were described a couple of years ago. It's a fossil Banksia leaf, so that's a fossil, obviously. That's a bit of a fossil. That's a living species which is closely related to it. You can see how prominent the veins are on these casts, and these are casts in very hard rock. And if you take a latex impression of these leaf surfaces and put it under the scanning electron microscope, you get this, and what you can see here is the veins are out here. There's little bits of latex still attached, but the veins are here, and you've got these deep pits in between, and you can very clearly see inside those the individual stomates. And there's the living species for comparison, this one. And these are xeromorphic species, and they are absolutely xeromorphic, even though they're about 45 million years old at this time of major rainforests, and they're sitting in the southwest of Western Australia. And I think the west coast of Western Australia shows enormous evidence, now that we're looking for it, of a refuge for the xeromorphic species. It must have been a relatively dry place, possibly on very sandy substrates, and that's where these plants survived through that period of great wetness. And there's a range of other leaf impressions that have been taken from Western Australia that almost certainly will demonstrate the same kind of response when we look at them a little closer. There's the one that was published, or another example of that one, but plenty of others there. They're all Proteaceae. It's a remarkable family. One of the other things that happened through this time that impacted on rainfall, probably, is the movement of the subtropical high pressure cell that controls the boundary between summer rainfall and winter rainfall in Australia. So where we are now, here, we have this subtropical high pressure cell, and because of where it's placed on the continent, the summer-winter rainfall boundary runs through about Sydney and across southern Australia. So if you live south of that, as we do, you have a dry summer and a hot summer, and that's very difficult for plants to survive in. And so we have the kind of very arid-adapted vegetation that's typical here. If you go north in Australia, and especially in Queensland, you have summer-dominated rainfall, so it's hot and wet at the same time, and then you get really complex rainforest. So the distinction that this boundary causes is enormous. And if you go back in time, the subtropical high pressure cell moved northwards faster than Australia did. So if you go back 20 million years ago, it was far enough south of Australia that all of Australia was in a summer rainfall belt. And it's only through time that that belt has moved up faster than Australia has. And so southern Australia has copped this really major problem of a developing summer dry period. So there's quite a few complications in this that add to the story. And that's, there's lots of ways this can be depicted, but in this particular diagram that covers 20 million years, there's the current water level in southern Australia. That's plus and minus from that. And you can see that back 20 million years ago it was considerably wetter. There's been fluctuations, but it's dried out over that time. I won't go into detail on that, it's not important enough to this particular story. It does have a gap that's named after me though, which is quite impressive. There's a couple of things that have been named after me when we don't know anything about it, which is kind of disturbing actually. So let me just turn to fire quickly. So Australia's dried out again in the last 20 million years after this big rainforest phase. We've got nutrient poor conditions, plant litter accumulates, it dries out because of the drying climate, that's fuel for fires, and inevitably the fire frequency in Australia and the intensity starts to increase again. So very roughly speaking, and I'm not going into detail on this and I'm not a fire ecologist, Australian plants I think you can divide into basically three groups. There are species that are fire intolerant, and that's most rainforest, mangroves and alpine species. There's species that are fire resistant. There's a huge number of strategies for fire resistance in Australia, and I'll show you some of those. And then there's a small group that are fire promoting, and this is controversial. Some people don't like the term fire promoting. I think inevitably you have to say we have species that actually make fire worse to their advantage, and Eucalyptus is the obvious candidate for that, at least some species. So here's some examples. Fire intolerant vegetation. If you burn alpine vegetation, it doesn't come back. So that's a fire scar more than 20 years after the fire. You can still take one step and cross the boundary. So that's the worst case, vegetation that just can't do it. Fire-resistant vegetation, I won't go into too much detail. Xanthorrhoea is a classic. It does more than one thing. When Xanthorrhoea catches fire, it's got this enormous dead thatch of leaves with all sorts of highly flammable things in there, and they go off almost like an explosion. The heat of the fire makes the growing tip contract down into the stem, so it's got some protection, some insulation from the heat, and so they'll come back vegetatively very quickly following a fire. The growing tip is not burnt. They also have a flowering response. You often see mass flowering of Xanthorrhoea after a fire with thousands of flowers on each flower stalk, and that seed is released into a nutrient bed which is into an ash bed which is relatively high in nutrients, so they've got a good chance of establishing in the absence of competition and with high nutrient loads around. So that's fire resistance. Banksias do it. They have many of the species have these woody cones that don't open. They just sit there on the plant. If they burn, the desiccation caused by the death of the parent plant leads to the cone opening up. The seed is released again onto an ash bed. This is a riskier strategy because the parent plant dies in the process, and if these seeds are then form plants and another fire comes along too quickly, they can be knocked out of a site by fire frequencies that are too high, as opposed to Xanthorrhoea, which can come back vegetatively as well. Storing seed in the soil is a good fire-resistant strategy. These are acacia seedlings that have come up, that have been stored in the soil potentially for decades. Fire comes along, the heat of the fire cracks the seed coat, and they then take off and germinate. And then fire-promoting vegetation, eucalypts. Eucalypts have lots of strategies. Epichlormic shoots that are released from dormancy after fire are very well known and very obvious when you see it out in the field. They also have woody fruits which do tend to release their seed but usually retain some seed, and if you have a fire the seed is released onto the ash bed and there's a very healthy eucalypt regrowth underneath a dead stand of mature trees. Okay, so the fossil record of fire for the last 20 million years, the best evidence we've got is from the Latrobe Valley coal. This is David Blackburn who did this work in this building, in fact, about 30-something years ago. The Latrobe Valley coal is very complex. If you dry it out, you can see there's very different coloured bands all through it. David did this extraordinary thing. He did a vertical transect through 70 metres of coal with a chainsaw, taking a sample every metre on the way down. So he had about 70 data points going down through a time series into the past. And he reconstructed the vegetation that occurred there. This is the vertical transect, so this is near the present, this is back into the past. This is charcoal, so you can see how variable charcoal is. And here's one of the fossil species, plant species. It tends to be absent when fire is present. It's not a perfect relationship. And here's another one where it tends to be present when fire is present. So there's complex ecologies coming out of these fossils, and you can reconstruct the vegetation from them. And he found a successional series in the coal from open water, which gradually fills up with organic matter, where there's obviously no fire, through lakeside vegetation, where you get rainforest, very low amounts of fire, quite pale coal. And as you get more and more organic matter building up, it gets further and further away from the water table, and you end up with banksias, casuarinas, and so on, and the highest fire frequency of all. And then every now and then the whole basin would slump and the whole thing starts over again. So that's how the Latrobe Valley coal probably formed up. So the one group of plants I haven't talked about in terms of their evolutionary history is the Eucalypts, and we've been doing some work on this recently, so I'll just very quickly go through this. I'm going to talk about them as the Eucalypts, not as Eucalyptus, because the taxonomists have made a mess of this, and so we can't easily say what we're talking about anymore, but Eucalypts will do, and that's what I'm considering as part of that. The pollen record is good and surprising, especially compared to the Proteaceae, because what it suggests is that the whole family, Myrtaceae, not just the Eucalypts, is only about 83 to 85 million years old and comes from Africa. They then disperse northwards and south. and they got down to Antarctica by about the end of the Cretaceous, around 65 million years ago. The pollen evidence of Eucalypts themselves suggests that they arose about 65 million years ago. Now, that's really interesting if you think back to those reconstructions of oxygen. That means the suggestion from the pollen is that the Eucalypts didn't come along until after the oxygen levels had dropped and we were out of that major fire zone. So Eucalypts probably evolved at about the time that atmospheric oxygen level was dropping, and the evidence for fire was dropping globally. Now, there could be some logic in that. These are fire promoters, in my view. It's probably not terribly smart being a fire promoter when everything inside is burning. So maybe this is exactly the strategy you'd expect from a group of plants that came along adapted to fire when fire is actually declining. So they're doing things, they're evolving things to try and keep the level up. And the place where I think we might have expected to go looking for these is an open forest in a monsoonal climate where you have a high frequency of natural lightning strikes. And that's not a very good example, but it's the best I could find of a photograph that might explain that. So the fossil record of Eucalypts is bizarre, actually. The oldest fossils we've got are from Argentina, where it no longer occurs. We have leaves. Notice how these are really long and thin, these leaves. They're 52 million years old. They have fruits. And just keep in mind this, or maybe this one, this particular photograph here of what that looks like. Because I'll show you something else in a moment. Here's the site they come from. And they have flowers, which are just extraordinarily well preserved. So there's not only no doubt these are Eucalypts, they are in the genus Eucalyptus, and you can put them fairly deep into the phylogeny. So at 52 million years ago, highly evolved Eucalypts were present in South America without any doubt. And that's where they fit into the phylogeny. We have fossils from a similar age, but much more poorly preserved, in both Australia and New Zealand. So these are the New Zealand fossils, and I really, really wish these didn't exist. So they have leaves that look quite similar to those Argentinian Eucalypts. Look at that reproductive structures, their set of structures. They do look an awful lot like that photograph I had earlier, the South American ones. These are from the Eocene in New Zealand, and the more you think about that, the more difficult that is to explain. So here we go. New Zealand separated from Gondwana in the Santonian about 84 to 85 million years ago, and it was a separate landmass from then on, much earlier than Australia. We didn't separate till about 35 million years ago. That predates the time of, or the likely time of origin of the Eucalypts by 20 million years. So if those are Eucalypts, if they really are Eucalypts in New Zealand, then you get one of three choices. The time of origin is incorrect, and it was at least 84 to 85 million years, so it wasn't 65, it was 20 million years earlier, and therefore Eucalypts were able to get to New Zealand before it separated from Gondwana. Or the early Eucalypts dispersed over an ocean barrier to New Zealand at a very early stage in their history, so it's long distance dispersal to get to New Zealand by 45 million years ago. Or the Eucalypts evolved in New Zealand in the first place and then dispersed everywhere else over ocean barriers. All three of those are fairly unlikely. Number three I think you could probably write off as out of the question, but the first two are going to be very hard to pull apart if indeed those are Eucalypt fossils. There's no Eucalypt pollen in New Zealand in the early to middle Eocene, which may make you think those fossils aren't Eucalypts. The trouble is you've seen the South American Eucalypts and there's no Eucalypt pollen there either. So that doesn't help a lot. In Australia we have quite poorly formed fossils of this age. There's some examples. You can see they're the same kind of leaf shape, but the evidence here is really poor from that age. The best example we've got is probably from some Central Australian silkretes, and I still haven't managed to find a photograph of those, and I'm still trying to find out where the collections are that have occasionally been called Eucalypts without ever illustrating them. There are some specimens from a place called Nellie Creek in south central Australia. We've got some of these here. These are our specimens. These were published quite a while ago. The leaves and the fruits here aren't necessarily from the same species, and one of the things we're trying to do at the moment, or Miles trying to do, is find more of those out of the sediments we've got that have never been broken down. So the hunt is on to see if we can pull these into the Eucalypt story somehow. One of the things you find in Australia a bit later on is fossil deposits where you get layers of eucalypt leaves and nothing else, here and here in two different sites. And then if you go a little bit further up in the sedimentary sequence, you get nothing but rainforest. And what that's suggesting to me is that at this time, eucalypts were starting to get closer to the coast and they were intermingling with the rainforest just the way they do today. So they're fire boundaries, except what we're seeing is fire boundaries moving through time. If you go out today and have a look at one particular place, you see fire boundaries in space. So I think the Eucalypts came early, this is about 25 million years ago, to the east coast of Australia, and it was very fire related. There's a group of wonderful fossils from Central Australia that Bob Lange, who worked in this building as well, spent much of his time looking at when he was here. These are from silcretes that are probably around 7 to about 15 million years old from Central Australia, and they have an incredible diversity of myrtaceae fruits within them. And I just picked up someone from the airport this morning that's here for 12 months that's going to help us to have a look at these and try and make a bit more sense of them. The entire collection that Bob Lange worked on has been donated to the South Australian Museum, so we've got access to it now. So if you pull all that together, what you see is a story where we had this big rainforest dominance through the period from about 40 million years up to 10, 15, 20, something like that. And then the myrtaceae starts to take over in Australia, and much later in the piece, daisies and grasses, and we start getting the genuinely arid zones starting to form up. And fire is these bars here, and you can see how much fire has come into play during that last, in this case, 7 or 8 million years ago. It's in central New South Wales. But it's typical of what you see around Australia in various places. So just to finish, the Eucalypts in New Zealand, I wouldn't take those Eocene ones as seriously if it wasn't for the fact that they also have Miocene Eucalypts that look a whole lot better. So they've got these leaves, or these are the illustrations of the leaves in a close-up, and there's some fruits from a Miocene site in New Zealand that really do look very plausibly Eucalyptus. If we found those in Australia, we'd have no hesitation about them. And likewise in South America, they lasted for a long time. This is a terrible photograph, but historically it's really important. These were described in the 1950s in South America as Eucalyptus. No one believed them. They were published in Spanish and everybody ignored it. They've since found much better examples, and they clearly are Eucalyptus. He was right all the time, and all the Australians that said he was wrong were wrong all the time. So Eucalyptus lasted in South America for at least 25 million years, and it possibly lasted the same amount of time in New Zealand. One of the great questions in evolutionary biology in the Southern Hemisphere is, why did Eucalyptus become extinct in South America and New Zealand? And we have no idea. So to summarise and finish off, the iconic Australian scleromorphic heath vegetation has its origins at least as far back as the late Cretaceous, about 75 million years ago. That's just tens of millions of years earlier than we'd ever previously believed. The widespread complex rainforests that dominated much of Australia from around 50 to 30 million years ago were certainly an important source for the modern vegetation, but nowhere near as significant perhaps as we've always believed they were. We have to start recasting the way we're looking at this. And that's because Central and Western Australia were probably refuges for the xeromorphic descendants of those late Cretaceous plants during the time of rainforest dominance. So there were places where these things hid effectively as far as the fossil record's concerned, and we're just beginning to find out about that. We don't yet know how this xeromorphic vegetation contributed to the living Australian vegetation, but that's something we still need to find out. Most critically at the moment, we need more late Cretaceous sites. We're looking for them. We've got one. But the nice thing about the fossil record is if you find a fossil record, you have to explain it, even if it's only a single one. We need better dating of the Seal Creek floras in Central Australia and the ones in Western Australia. And we have to keep working on a better sense of the early history of the Eucalypts. And I think that's effectively an achievable objective for the next 10 years. And finally, I'll just say there's quite a lot of people that help with this, and they're all up there in alphabetical order so they don't get annoyed with each other. And just show you this as a final photograph. That's the oldest Banksia cone that's ever been found. That's about 45 million years old from the Kennedy Range, which is about halfway up Western Australian coast. That was described in 1983, and for a long time that looked totally out of place. It just seemed bizarre that there was a Banksia cone of that age up there. All of a sudden it's starting to look quite at home. Thank you.